Buongiorno, benvenuti a tutti a questo
Good
incontro
morning
con il professor
and
Kaushik
welcome
BASU,
to this
che
meeting with
fa
Professor
lavoro nel
Kaushik.
mondo dell'economia.
BASU, there's always
So che anche l'altra
nobody in the
sala
hall. I know
schiera
that
completamente
even there's another room with us, another screen, and
È
there's a
un
full house
ritorno, sono
again,
felice ritorno
as
quello del
is
professor
usual
BASU
with
perché è
the
stato già
Festival
ospite del
of the
Festival
Economia.
dell'Economia nella sua
Kaushik
prima
BASU was a guest of the festival in
aperta il
its first
professore era
edition,
già un
so
docente della Cornell
and he was
University,
already a professor at the Cornell University. He was an advisor to the Indian
economista,
government.
allievo del premio Nobel
He was an
Amartya Sen.
economist who had been
Nel
a scholar
frattempo,
with
negli anni
Amartya
che sono
Sen,
trascorsi da allora,
and
ha
over the
preso
years
una
that went
scattatina
by,
dalla Cornell University perché
he took a leave
è
from the
stato
Cornell
chiamato alla
University.
Banca
He was
Mondiale
called upon by the
dove
World Bank,
ricopre il ruolo di
where he
economista
is
capo
the chief
e
economist
senior
and
vicepresidente.
senior vice
Ma
president as well.
soprattutto in questi anni ha scritto
Over
e
the past few
pubblicato un
years,
libro
he's published a
nel
book.
2011
The book got
che si
published in
intitola Oltre la
2011,
mano invisibile,
which is Beyond
ripensare
the Invisible
l'economia per
Hand,
una società
Rethinking
giusta,
Economy for a
che
Just Society.
è freschissimo di stampa in
And
Italia.
this book
Infatti
has just been translated into Italian.
di
Indeed,
questo mese, del maggio
it was published May 2013 in Italy.
Questo direi è forse l'apporto maggiore dello studio di Kaushik BASU.
And I believe that this is the greatest contribution by Professor Kaushik
che verrà
BASU.
discusso questo
This is a
pomeriggio
book that is going to
nell'ambito
be
degli
presented during the
incontri
afternoon with the meeting with the
del
author,
collega Tonio Mastrobuoni,
with
in cui
Tonia
il
Mastrobuoni.
professor BASU discuterà con
Professor BASU is going to talk with Professor Luigi Zingales about the subject matter of his book. I don't know if you agree on anything. It's going to be quite a challenging meeting again. Indeed, I like to get ready to that meeting. I looked at the book, I skipped through it, I started reading it, and I think it is quite an important book. I like to go through the main features of this book, of what I think are the main features of this book, before giving him the floor. On reading this book, I felt I could understand it, despite me not being an economist, and so I believe that this is truly a book which is addressed to the wide audience, not just to the experts. The second reason why I appreciate this book is its timeliness. Indeed, over the past few years, all of us have been ruled by the dictatorship of economics. We know that very well. In Italy, we've called upon the economists to rule the country in the last but one government in Italy. So we look at economics as something that rules the world, that makes us do what we have to do, that sets its laws and rules of our daily life. And the book basically sadly tells us that this is not necessarily the case. Indeed, the book tells us that economy can be discussed and looked upon in a different perspective, especially if compared to mainstream economists. So I believe that this is a book more devoted to economic thinking, and it questions the mainstream economic thinking. This is a book that certainly is published by the chief executive of the World Bank, by somebody who's actually maybe considered as mainstream economy, and that challenges mainstream economy as well. When I looked at the book by Kaushik BASU, I was really very much taken aback by the fact that there is an issue which is discussed because, and there's something that is considered as inevitable, very much as the weather is, and this issue is inequalities. Indeed, as we read in the very first pages, we see that inequalities is increasing, and as a matter of fact, inequalities are at top level and at an unparalleled level. Indeed, the gap between the have and the have-nots is really at the highest level. And the writer says, economic thinking all too often tries and justifies this, but as the author says, this is not necessarily the role of economists. And as a matter of fact, the author believes that the role of economists is in fact that of challenging this approach and to try and tackle the problem. So the problem of inequalities is also very closely correlated to the issue, the main issue of the festival this year, sovereignty in conflict, because when inequality takes place within societies and when it takes place among nations and economies, this role is very much questioned. It's my well-being can only be on condition that you are have to bear with an ill being. Well, then the causes for conflict certainly are all there. Having said this much, I'd like to give the floor to Professor Kaushik BASU without any further ado. Thank you, Professor.
Pietro, thank you very much for that very warm introduction. I should also begin by thanking Tito Boeri here, Giuseppe Latarza for the invitation to come back to Trento. And I say come back because I was here actually 8 years ago. And it gives me just great pleasure to be here. I have to say, walking around and seeing the squares with people gathering for discussions, it is reminding me of what one has read. I know the analogy is not exact, but 3rd and 4th century BC, gatherings around Socrates and Plato, people gathering, students gathering for discussions in squares. It is reminiscent of that, and having the backdrop of the beautiful buildings, of course, makes that feel even more real. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to be back in that setting. We are living through one of the most unusually difficult phases for the global economy for 2 reasons. One happens to be the immediate problems. The problems that you living in Italy, you're feeling it directly. A lot of it is caused by things which happened in the short run. The subprime crisis in the United States in the housing market, the sovereign debt crisis in Europe. But I also believe that a lot of this has deeper causes of the problems that you're seeing. Causes which are rooted in globalization, causes which are rooted in new technologies which have developed over the years. No one is responsible for these causes. And let me begin by telling you what my belief about globalization is. Globalization is not done by any single individual taking a decision about it. It's the outcome of thousands and millions and billions of individuals discovering little bits of new technology, little ways of doing things that has led to globalization. Globalization is now a fact of life, a bit like gravity. You may not like gravity, but to have a discussion about whether to have gravity or not is a completely pointless discussion. And globalization is a bit like that. There are aspects of globalization which you need to tackle. There are important challenges which you need to tackle. And I plan to come back to this. And the conflict of sovereignty is a very nice title for me, because my book, which was just mentioned by Pietro, has a lot of discussion on the notion of sovereignty and its conflict. And I will, towards the end of the talk, come into that matter. Today's crisis is a crisis of these economies, but it's also a crisis of economics, economics as a discipline. That is what my book is about, and I do want to touch on the crisis of the economics discipline and how we have to chart out into new paths. You know, I've been very lucky in observing the global crisis because I've seen it from different places. There are some scientists who specialize in studying storms, who get into planes and follow the storm as the storm is progressing. I had a natural advantage of that kind. When the crisis was developing in the beginning, It was the mortgage market in the United States where the crisis first developed, 2007, 2008. I used to be a professor in United States, reading the newspapers, reading magazine columns, and trying to understand the subprime crisis. Then by 2009, the crisis had moved out to the rest of the world. And I was very lucky. Just then, I also moved out from the United States and went to India as an advisor. So I was now following the crisis to the rest of the world. And over the last 7 months, I've been with the World Bank. So as the crisis becomes a global crisis, I'm getting to get a perspective on that, which is very, very rich. I'm going to discuss today's topic from both the challenges in industrialized countries, Europe included, but a little bit from the perspective of emerging economies, developing countries, for two reasons. I got to see it from India when the crisis was first developing, and in the World Bank, that is my charge, and that is what I get to do. You know, when I went to India, in the beginning, it felt as if it's the same group I'm interacting with, because at the top, where you're having discussions, whether in Rome or Washington, London, New Delhi, or Dar es Salaam, the discussion is very similar. People are educated in the same places, very, very similar discussion. But when you go down into society, that you begin to see differences. I have to tell you, my first realization that I'm in a totally different country when I went from the US to India was in my first week. I was the chief economic advisor to the government. I had a government driver who was in charge of taking me around. And my very first week, when I got into the seat and was reaching out to put on my seat belt in the car, my driver in Delhi, a proud driver of the government, who knew that I used to be a professor and now I'm the main advisor to the Indian government, he turned to me and very shyly said, "Sir, now that you're the chief economic advisor of the country, you don't need to use a seatbelt anymore." You know, it's a sudden realization that it is a very, very different view that you're contending with. It's a respect of individual liberty taken to its extreme, where he's telling me that I need not put on the seatbelt anymore. It's my decision from here onwards. In fact, I'm remembering the only other time I've had a similar experience was a flight from Zanzibar to Dar es Salaam. Only time on a flight where no one told me to fasten my seatbelts. And I really respect the respect for individual liberty on that. It was my choice whether I did it or not. Well, with that, let me get into the more serious problems, and let me straight away show you the kind of thing which led to the problem that Italy is today engulfed in. It is to do with the following. The subprime crisis was, yes, it played a major role, but the subprime crisis simply lit the match on something which was ready to light up. So it's not fundamental. It was a problem. I've written about it, analyzed it. I will not go into it in the United States. But by 2010, we are seeing the sovereign debt crisis of Europe. And the European sovereign debt crisis is a bigger crisis. And beneath that are faults in the creation of the Eurozone. There are defects and faults in the creation of the Eurozone. I'm saying this a bit self-consciously and not at all critically, because the creation of the Eurozone is one of the biggest experiments, deliberate human experiments in the economy. It's not surprising that there will be defects in that, but it is some of these defects which showed up and created the first crisis. I'm going to show you one picture which to me summarizes this actually perfectly. This is a picture of borrowing costs of different countries in the Eurozone from 1999. When the Eurozone got created, everyone misunderstood. I don't think there was anyone who fully understood the fault line, and the fault line was this. I'm going to explain this picture to you in one moment. The fault line was this. Eurozone was a monetary union, but it was not a fiscal union. When a government in the Eurozone borrows money, it is the responsibility of that government to pay it back. It's not a collective responsibility of the Eurozone. This was not realized by anyone, including the investors in the beginning. So soon after the Eurozone got created, 1999, at the start of that picture, the borrowing costs for all the Eurozone countries were roughly the same. So Germany and Greece borrowing at roughly the same interest payment that they are making. This continues for a long time. Then what happened with the subprime crisis is 2008 Lehman crash, and the whole global economy being in trouble made investors go very cautious, and one realization dawned that Eurozone has the same money, but the borrowing is done by different governments with their individual responsibility to pay back. And then you suddenly see like a fan opening up, the borrowing costs of different countries become different very, very suddenly. And the opening up that you're seeing at the end over there, Greece, extremely expensive for Greece to borrow money. The bottom end is Germany and the northern Eurozone countries borrowing money at a much lower cost. This realization is the crux of the problem, and I want to explain this to you a little bit more in detail. You know, the problem that arose with this is the following, and I realized this, understood this in India very, very clearly on a particular day. The day is in my head because that's the day when Standard & Poor's downgraded United States. It's a sign of a globalized world that United States being downgraded became a major news all around the world. I remember that evening very well because I was actually in a fish market buying fish in New Delhi when my cell phone began to ring more frequently than it usually does. And finally, I was recognizing the names of journalists whom I knew. They were calling me repeatedly in the evening, and I knew something important had happened. It was the US being downgraded by Standard & Poor's. We immediately that evening, it's a globalized world, you knew there would be consequences for the rest of the world. You get together, you huddle together and try to see what will happen. We didn't anticipate quite what happened after that, and this is very important for my story. Over the next few days, it was United States that had been downgraded, but money was being pulled out, investor money, from all over the world, and the money was going into the United States, into treasuries. People were buying treasuries. What had happened? Why was this happening? And the reason is now we can see, and it has to do with the construction of the Eurozone countries. Let me explain. First of all, when there is insecurity in the world, investors want to put money in safe countries. That money would be pulled out of Brazil, money would be pulled out of India, money would be pulled out of even South Korea and South Africa. Was not a surprise. These are newly emerging countries and people feel insecure. But money being pulled out of Europe and being sent to the United States was new. The reason why that was happening is very simple. It is to do with this graph. With this sudden realization which had taken place by 2008 and 9, you realize that unlike before 1999, if you give money to Spain, the Spanish government, if you give money to the Italian government, you know that there will not be a default. Italy and Spain will not tell an international investor in United States or in Korea or in Japan that we will not pay your money. What will they do? In the last resort, they will turn to their central bank and tell the central bank, look, Spain can't default, Italy can't default. We have to print money and pay back. Printing money is not a good thing to do to pay back. But as a last resort, you do that. Today, that is not possible because Italy does not have its central bank that can create money. Spain does not have its central bank that can create money. So the investors realize that the one big powerful country which has its own central bank is United States. So though United States was the cause of the trouble, people were putting in money into the treasuries because they knew that if it comes to a default risk, it will not happen because United States, the federal government will ask the Federal Reserve to monetize this and pay back the debt. That is what happened. When you put in money into another country, you also worry about exchange rate, of course. Even if there is no default, if the exchange rate crashes, you can lose your money. So if from Italy you put money in United States treasuries, you know that default won't happen. The US has its own central bank. But the dollar could crash. If the dollar crashes, you will lose the value of your money. There we have another kind of security, which is China. China has so much of its foreign exchange reserves in dollars that a crash of the dollars is going to have China's wealth suddenly collapse. China can't afford to allow the crash of the dollar. So I think for some time now, the dollar is, in terms of exchange rate, is safe enough because China has a vested interest in that dollar. You know, there is that old Keynesian story. John Maynard Keynes said that when you borrow $10 from your bank, you are under the control of your bank. But when you borrow $10 million from your bank is under your control after that. And it's something similar between China and the US. There's a lot of mutual dependence now because China holds huge amounts of US dollars in reserves. We don't know the exact value. No central bank will tell you the exact value. But there are ways of calculating, and we know must be close to the half of Chinese reserves. Chinese reserves are $4 trillion. Close to half of that will be in US dollars. So it's a massive amount in US dollars being held. So that's the guarantee over there, virtual. There's no guarantee in economic life, but virtual assurance. Let me now come back and explain to you a little bit more about the central banking and the borrowing by the government. Here, I do believe that there is a flaw in the Lisbon Treaty's Article 125, which makes it very difficult for the central bank to rescue directly a government. Now, I think this is being recognized. There are lots of people who are writing, criticizing Article 125 of the Lisbon Treaty. But the change of a clause of a treaty takes a lot of time. It's not easy. Also, the Lisbon Treaty inherits this clause from the earlier Maastricht Treaty. So there is a long history of this clause. I do think it will need a revisit and probably an amendment, but that is going to take time. What do you do in the meantime? Let me quickly show you the consequence of the graph that you have over here. When borrowing becomes cheap, as it did from 1999, countries tend to overborrow, and you can see the overborrowing in this picture, where you see the debt to GDP ratio of the euro area and of Greece. The red, or these colors get changed. What are you seeing? Red or maroon, magenta bars are Greece's debt to GDP ratio, and that goes up very steeply. For the euro area as a whole, it goes up. You know, in the olden days, since I've worked with the Indian government, every time Europe would be given as an example of a country where the fiscal deficit is being managed well, public debt is being managed well, and you would be told in India that, look, you have to learn from that and do better. It's very different now today in the world. The debt to GDP ratio in Europe is much higher than what you will get in the emerging economies. I know India's figure. India, the debt to GDP ratio figure is roughly 60 to 64% debt to GDP. And here you can see euro area is close to 100%, Greece is 160%, Japan, I should point out, is 200%. But Japan's borrowing is mostly in its own currency, so to that extent the risk is less. The pain that this crisis caused is clear, but I thought I'll use a graph from Italy to demonstrate to you that what is being felt is indeed true. It's an amazingly deep crisis that we are caught in the middle of. The Italian figure is as follows. On the left-hand side, above my head, you're seeing the rise in unemployment, and you're seeing the drop in the national income, the GDP, going down. And it's a very sharp change that is taking place over a 5-6 year period. So it's a very, very painful period for the world. And the figure on this side is not surprisingly, that's unsurprising, that industrial production is also going down. It's being mirrored. In the United States, unemployment is not as high as in Europe. The total unemployment is 7.5%, but underlying that unemployment figure, there is something very deep that is happening, which is very worrying. Of the people who are unemployed in the United States, 40% of them are long-term unemployed. So they've been unemployed for a very long period. This is very unusual in the United States. In fact, has not happened in the last several decades. I don't know if it has ever happened from 1944 after World War II. Such a large fraction of long-term unemployed people. When you have long-term unemployment, people begin to lose the skill for being in the labor force and of working. So there is a certain amount of de-skilling that is going on in the United States. So even though the unemployment is less, the problem is indeed very, very acute. Well, just a very quick picture, and I'll leave that to you. People talk in terms of decoupling, because I do want to go into decoupling and the emerging economy story. But what is happening today is a somewhat strange decoupling where the real economy is doing badly and the financial sector actually over the last 1 year has done moderately well. The stock market indices are picking up even while the real economy is doing badly. And what is this to do with? I'm going to give you one quick piece of advice and a little bit of a looking into the crystal ball about the future, and then I want to talk about developing countries. This picture is capturing something which is not totally unexpected. The financial markets began improving around 2011, end of 2011, more so from the beginning of 2012. The reason was that the industrialized countries decided collectively that they are going to inject more liquidity into the system. And you will recall that in end of 2011 and beginning of 2012, there was injection of liquidity of $1.3 trillion into banks in Europe to allow the banks to survive. This is called the LTRO. LTRO injections took place, huge amounts. They saved the banks. They injected liquidity, and really, if I was an European policymaker, I would do exactly that. Then in the middle of 2012, Mario Draghi made the statement, whatever it takes. The ECB will stand behind the sovereigns, whatever it takes, and the OMT was announced. Once again, if I was an European policymaker, I would do exactly that. However, you have to remember that what all these things are doing is they are injecting liquidity and giving you time to solve the problem. They are not solving the problem, they are giving you time. You need the time because you're in the middle of the crisis, but they are simply giving you the opportunity to do that. Here is my one concern which I must express that to you. This injection of liquidity that took place, the large injection of liquidity, this is not money injected endlessly. This is money which has a 3-year window. The money has to be paid back and is going to be pulled back from the banks at the end of 2014 and at the beginning of 2015. And unless some deep reforms go in from now up to then, I'm afraid that there is going to be one more round of turbulence for the Eurozone at the end of 2014, at the end of 2015, when this money has to be paid back. Fortunately, there are important moves that are being made, like a common supervisory authority for the banks of Europe. Very small steps have been taken. More will be taken in 2014. So who knows, maybe we will be lucky to avert that, but that is indeed a risk that we have to live with. Where do we go here? Let me point out that the developing countries are deeply concerned about this crisis and are embroiled in this crisis. You know, the growth rates of developing countries today in the global situation don't look bad. India is growing at roughly 5% per annum. China is growing at 7.7% per annum, 7.5 to 7.7% per annum. Indonesia is growing at over 6% per annum. Brazil's growth has come down to 2%, less than 2% per annum. But in today's world, these figures don't look bad. But you have to remember that these are countries with a lot of poor people. Let me give you the example of India, which I know very well. India was growing in the middle of 2000, from 2003 to 2008, at close to 9% per annum. Very rapid growth the country was seeing. It's now come down to 5%. But in India, there are 300 million people who are poor. And poor means abysmally poor. So any rocking of the economy, a sudden rise in food price, can affect this segment of the population very acutely. So the emerging economies, even if they are growing, they are extremely concerned. Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, where till 1995, which was really disturbing for the world, that the percentage of people below the poverty line was rising up to 1995. Fortunately, over the last 10 years, it's declining very clearly. From 1995 itself, it had slowed down, but it is coming down. But still, you have countries with 50%, 60%, 70% of the people living below the poverty line, and poverty line is $1.25 a day. So very low poverty line, large segment of the population living over there. Times are hard over here, but you have to remember that if the global economy does badly, it's going to rock the developing countries, and there you can see a kind of suffering which, no matter how big the crisis in Europe, is not going to happen. So the big question is, what do we do? It's a collective problem of the world. It's a problem of globalization. We have to attend to this problem with collective global rules. One of the important ones is to do with monetary policy. And I believe that we have to get global central banks to come together to coordinate and do their monetary policy together and coordinate on this in an important way. And let me explain to you why this is important and why I also feel that the Eurozone experiment is an important experiment. And it's a move in the right direction. I know there are difficulties. People are very critical of the construction of the euro, but it's a move in the right direction. You know, in Bank of England was established in 1694. When the Bank of England was being established, and even before that, there were central banks like Riksbanken in Sweden. When central banks were being created in the 17th century, economists, even just thinking individuals, policymakers realized that it is good to have competition in the production of goods. For producing cars, for producing clothes, for producing anything, it's good to have competition. But when it comes to producing money for the economy to run, central banking, you don't want competition. one economy should have one money creating authority. So the central bank was created. So one economy with one central bank. See the way the world has gone. Increasingly, we have a globalized world. The whole world is tending to become a single economy. Now, we had created one central bank for one nation over the last 200 years, 300 years. But today, the world economy is almost like a single economy, which means we are back again to where we were in the 17th century. A single economy with lots of money creating authorities. There must be over 200 central banks in the world, 200 money creating authorities, but increasingly one global economy. And this does lead to tensions of a kind that the world has not seen before. Look at Japan. With the new central bank chief, Kuroda, Japan decided that Japan is going to inject liquidity into the system because both Japan needs to get its inflation a little bit up. Japan usually suffers from deflation to get a bit of inflation going. And also that the Japanese exchange rate had got appreciated massively. So Japan wanted the exchange rate to be a bit more realistic. And I have to say, just as an independent economist, I think what Japan has done is right. That's the direction in which Japan had to go. But in today's world with separate decision-making bodies, as soon as one central bank and one government follows this policy, other governments begin to worry that, look, what will happen to our exchange rate? After all, exchange rate is no single person's entity. If it goes up, it's going up vis-a-vis someone else's exchange rate. So others begin to react. And we are seeing reactions and statements from China, from a whole host of countries about the Japanese move. And there is a concern in the world that there could be a currency war breaking out with every central bank and government trying to go in for policy changes which will be countering one another. So one country injects liquidity, then few months later another country injects liquidity. Now we have to get to the root of this, and one way to do that is to create a global group. I have in one of my writings called this a G major, not G20, G7 or G8, but G major. G major sounds like something to do with music, which is all to do with coordination. You need the major countries involved. So yes, you need United States, you need Europe with the ECB, you need Japan, you need China, you need India, you need also emerging economies, because today's world is a very, very globalized world. Get together some 20, 25 countries together and have this G major group of countries have coordinated central bank policies, so the risk of a currency war breaking out is vastly diminished because countries are working together, is the direction in which we need to go. This is to do with policy coordination. Let me show you now to do with another very important domain, and I know this is of concern to Italy, and this is going to bring me down to the questions of sovereignty. So we need coordination in terms of monetary policy, but there is also something happening in labor markets in the world which is creating global tensions and giving rise to greater inequality I want to comment on. But in going to that, let me first show you the deeper causes of today's problem, which is to do with the changing structure of the entire global economy. Here is the first picture, which gives you a demonstration of what is happening in the world. Actually concentrate only on the blue line, which is the BRICS countries' share of the global GDP. So if the whole world has a GDP of 100, the share of that, which is the BRICS countries, used to be about 16% in 1990. It is now 27%. You know, it's a kind of change that is very, very rare. to see this kind of a dramatic rise. Of course, the main driver within the BRICS is China, which is driving this. But from 1994, India is also growing very rapidly. So the Indian growth is also being captured in this. So that's the dramatic rise of the BRICS. And with that, you will see the trade, which earlier used to be southern countries, developing countries, would be mainly trading with industrialized countries. There is a huge rise in trade of southern countries. That's this picture. Look at it for one moment while I take a quick decision about what I want to cover. I've taken that decision. So look at this picture. This shows the trade that the southern countries, developing countries, do with developing countries. In the 1960s, it used to be less than 15%. In the first decade of this century, it is just less than 30%. And something which is not there in the graph, but World Bank's data shows unmistakably that in between 2010 and 2011, southern countries trade with southern countries crossed 50%. So more than 50% of southern purchase is taking place from southern countries. Again, China is a major driver, but in this case, even if you leave out China, the rest of the South is trading massively more with the South. So this is a bit of a southern resilience over here. And one more picture about investment, global investment coming from the South. Even now, the high-income countries are the major investors in the world. South is less, but a recent study by the World Bank shows that just before 2015, in the total investment in the world, the southern investment will overtake the high-income country investment, and it's going to go higher and higher over the next 15 years. Actually, I can give you one very interesting piece of data, which I, during my Indian job as advisor to the Indian government, I realized. Over the last 6 years, the amount of foreign direct investment from United Kingdom, Britain to India, and India to Britain, in 3 years of the 6 years, there was more investment from UK to India, and over the other 3 years, there was more investment from India to UK, which is something which was unthinkable. Yes, it is the big Indian companies like Tata and other groups investing in UK, but this is a pattern that we had not seen in the world before. So there is a certain change of the structure which is indeed taking place in the world. Where is it coming from and what do you do? And this changing structure is causing a lot of turbulence. Part of this is to do with globalization, change of technology and labor market. So let me go into these deeper causes. Pietro, tell me if I take another 10 minutes, am I doing okay for time? Okay. So where is this coming from? See, technology has done something which it has made almost a common pool of the global labor market. This is, I know, causing great difficulties, but this is a fact of life. There is a lovely paper by Eric Maskin and Michael Kramer about this. But let me give you in a nutshell what's happening. Work earlier, the most valuable resource for economic development, which is labor, was balkanized into countries. So Indian labor lived and worked in India for Indian firms. South African labor did that for South Africa. Philippines labor did that for the Philippines. But this has been changing because of technology. It is possible to have basic services, not the high-skilled work. A lot of the basic labor market has today become a common pool. You know, the irony of the global economy, I remember in 2003, 2004, on American television, in the evenings, prime time, there would be a lot of conservative television commentators who would repeatedly talk about unpatriotic American firms that are sending work abroad for cheaper labor in the whole world. As a consequence of this repeat attack on television in the evenings, what happened was more work started going out to the rest of the world, because it was almost like an advertisement on television saying that you can make more profit if you send out your work to the rest of the world. And advertising on prime time television is extremely expensive in the United States. These small firms located in the Philippines, in South Africa, in China would not be able to advertise on American television. But the attack repeatedly amounted to that, and work started going out. Now, good or bad, it is a fact of life that thanks to technology, a whole lot of different kinds of work is going out all over the world. And you can see the effect of this in terms of inequality. What's happening is the rich end of the developing countries are becoming richer. So inequality in poor countries is increasing dramatically because the more skilled workers in these countries are participating in the global labor pool. The less skilled workers in the the industrialized countries are a part of the same pool, and they are finding a downward pull on their wages, and inequality in industrialized countries is on the rise. Inequality is rising in United States, inequality is rising in China, inequality is rising in India. Within these countries, it's getting pulled. What do you do about this? I feel, first of all, we cannot grudge this, because the people who are benefiting from the labor market in the emerging countries, and today Africa is beginning to join in this in a big way, they are very, very poor people. We should celebrate the fact that they are today coming into the global market. But there are structures to do with economic policy that need to be changed in a very deep, fundamental way. The crisis of the economies today is also a crisis of the subject of economics, of the discipline of economics. You have to think of very different ways of solving the problems. I think it is possible. There will be a period of intellectual churning where you have to think, you have to ruminate, you have to cogitate, you have to discuss to get newer policies onto the table. And I have to say that the kind of thing that you're doing in Trento, I feel is important. I'm going to try to push this idea in India, that if once a year they can get together in a small town and get a whole lot of actors in the place to think and deliberate to get a country going, we must do so. I want to tell you a little bit about the fundamental problems of the economic discipline, which we have to open up because of globalization, because the global structure has changed. The global structure has changed in a way where there is nothing that you can do individually, I can do individually. That's a fact of life. That is a bit like gravity. John Stuart Mill, giving a lecture in 1858, had said about the laws of the market, that you may not like the laws of the market, but you can't deny the laws of the market. The laws of the market are there. It is to deny the laws of the market, John Stuart Mill said, is a bit like a sailor who is going out into the sea, who does not like the laws of the winds and the waves, and says that I will deny the laws of the winds and the waves. That sailor will come to grief. The sailor has to recognize the laws of the winds and the waves and take advantage of that. Likewise, the laws of the market, the laws of globalization. You have to recognize these laws and take advantage of that. What are the problems that these laws are causing? You will, if you look at global inequality, you will realize that. What has happened in the world is there has been economic globalization. By the way, globalization did not start today. Globalization started 70,000 years ago when our ancestors, all our ancestors, common ancestors from Africa, set out from Africa into the rest of the world. Globalization started. Globalization went on in a small way. Every 5,000 years, there would be a movement of people from one region to another. But globalization became very rapid from 1945, after World War II, massively speeded up globalization. What has this led to? The opportunities for income and wealth have become huge. But while there is economic globalization, we have not had political globalization. Politics remains balkanized, small segments looking after their own interests. We have to face up to this and think of global democratic norms which have to be brought into place. We have to have global decision-making bodies which brings not only United States and Europe and Japan onto the table, but even Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, South Asia onto the table to a common platform for discussion. And to understand what the lack of global democracy is doing, I'll give you one figure. Inequality in the world. This is a bit of an old data. I have not revisited the numbers for some time, but inequality numbers don't change very dramatically. In 2007, if you take the world's 10 richest people, their total income of the 10 richest people, by the way, one interesting fact about the 10 richest people in the world is 5 of them dropped out of their university education. They never completed that. So in case you people have completed your university education, you've deflected yourself from that path of being very, very likely from the 10 richest people. Now the 10 richest people in the world, if you look at their income, it is more than the income in that year of the entire population of Ethiopia. Actually more than double the entire population of Ethiopia. By some calculations it's 3 times, but certainly more than double. Ethiopia is 70 million people. And Ethiopia also has lots of rich people. So if you take out the rich segment of Ethiopia out, you can see where the bottom 90% of Ethiopia is compared to the 10 richest people in the world. I'm an economist. I know that you need a certain amount of inequality in the world for that to be a driver of progress, for people to strive. But inequality of this kind, where the 10 richest people have an income more than double the income of the entire country of Ethiopia, there is something wrong. And I'll tell you, if there was global democracy, if we were sitting down with a global government looking at it, it would be considered intolerable. This level of inequality is intolerable in Italy. This level of inequality is intolerable in the United States. This level of inequality is intolerable in India. But it happens in the world because the global democracy institutions are very, very weak. There is no one who is attending to this problem of global inequality. And I think this needs attending to. What do you do about this? For this, once again, you need policies, global policies, to do with labor markets, to do with fiscal policy, to do with monetary policy, which begins to bring up the bottom segment of the world very, very rapidly to a tolerable, much more tolerable level of income. The sorts of problems that we have seen in the Middle East erupting, those problems will not go away unless we attend to the problem of global democracy. The details of how you do that, as I said earlier, are to do a lot with restructuring of economic thought as well. We need changes in economic policy, but we need changes in economic thought. And I will take 3 or 4 minutes to tell you a little bit about the kinds of changes we need in economic thinking, and I will stop with that and then take questions from you. But before going into economic thinking, criticizing my own discipline, I need a little bit of water. Markets are extremely important. The laws of the market are extremely important. The private sector, critically important. Entrepreneurship, critically important. But to go to the other extreme and to take a market fundamentalist position and to say that leave it all to the markets and things will be fine is a travesty of economics. This comes from a supposed wisdom, ancient wisdom, from 1776, Adam Smith's book, and the notion of the invisible hand. The invisible hand says roughly that individuals pursuing their own selfish ends can bring a certain order to the economy. It's like an invisible hand. You are doing your work not thinking about the economy. You are an economist writing your papers. You are a trader doing your trade. You are a book publisher publishing books. You are a clothes producer producing clothes. You're all doing it individually. But Adam Smith made this dramatic discovery that the market plays the role of an invisible hand which allows all of these to be coordinated together. But to treat that as a law which says that individual selfishness is fine, let everyone be endlessly selfish and you will get social goodness coming out of it, is something that Adam Smith actually never said. And that's a market fundamentalism which should have no room in our policy-making space. You know, one way of realizing that Adam Smith didn't realize how this would be taken out of context is the term invisible hand in Adam Smith's book appears after page 200, very late in the book. And when Adam Smith in his own lifetime created the index to his book, he never put in the word invisible hand in the index. So Adam Smith didn't even realize how important it would become. But people who take this extreme view, that leave it all to selfish maximization, you don't need any coordinating hand and you will get order, they are getting it wrong. If you don't believe me, one way in which you can prove this to yourself is if you go to old Delhi, the old part of Delhi, and look at the traffic over there. There will be no shortage of individual rationality in the drivers. They drive to maximize their selfish targets. Driving on any side of the road, trying to drive as fast as possible, just individual optimization. And you will not see order in Old Delhi, you will see utter chaos in traffic. So it is the opposite of that wisdom, that leave it all to individual selfishness and you will get order. You don't see that. You do need the coordinating hand of the state. That plays a very, very major role. But even more than that, something which Adam Smith stressed and our modern guru, Kenneth Arrow, wrote very beautifully about the role of altruism, about social norms, about even culture, that those are important ingredients of a society to flourish. The society needs social norms, needs culture, needs coordination. Economics somehow left those out. Our early economics textbooks over the last 50 years were cut and dried analysis of individuals maximizing their profit. And you think that you will get perfect social order out of that. Fortunately, over the last 10 years, 15 years, there is a body that realizes that you do need social norms of certain kinds. You need culture of certain kind to flourish for society to do well. And once again, I feel that a group of this kind that has got together over here, bringing different kinds of thinkers together, plays a role, and it's a role that ought to begin to change the way we write our textbooks of economics, and that is going to permeate a new set of policy thinking which will lead the world to a better world. And I have to say, despite all the difficulties, I personally remain very, very optimistic that we will go through this difficult phase. We won't come out of it very quickly. At least 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, but we will come out of it and it will be better times for the world as a whole. Thank you very much.
Ringraziamo il professor Kaushik.
Thank you very much, Professor BASU, for your very clear and rich presentation. Thank you for helping us frame our pictures in the winds and waves of global economy so as not to feel too much as Euro victims. I am sure you have questions you want to address to Professor BASU. Please raise your hand if you have any questions. I have one question myself, if I may. You said that in the flow of interest foreign investments between UK and India over the past 6 years, you said that over the past 3 years you saw an U-turn basically in the proportion. But are these 3 years after 3 years, do you think there's a trend there, or is 1 year one way, 1 year the other prevailing? Second question. I think that this is a question on behalf of all of the audience. So what did you do with the safety belt? I believe they were all wondering what you did with that, because I saw that your doctoral thesis was on the choice. So perhaps this is a question that has a general interest. It's not just work as an anecdote. So now the floor is open for question. Do you have any questions? Raise your hand and you'll be given a mic. Thank you. You referred to a global monetary policy. Don't you think that in Europe we need also a labor policy, which is one single European policy, so as to actually have one market also on the rights side, so that we have one single market for labor throughout Europe?
Yeah, let me take both these questions. The UK and India, over the last 6 years, there is no trend. It's some years that there's more investment that has gone from India to UK. Some years it has been from UK to India. It's not as if the first 3 years was one way and the second 3 years the other way. But compared to, say, 15 years ago, this was even unthinkable that there would be a single year where India would invest more in UK than UK would in India. So if you take a bit of a long term, this is probably an indication of a trend. And the figure which is luckily still up there is the World Bank's more detailed computation, which suggests that that is probably going to be a global trend. The seatbelt, actually the first day when my driver said that to me, I felt very embarrassed to offend him. So I did not use a seatbelt. I just held on to my seat and took that precaution. After that, I persuaded him that one would have to use the seatbelt. Your question, extremely valid. And I do believe that you need a common labor market policies. And let me get into something which I know is a touchy topic, but I still want to get into. I do believe, that you need labor market policies to have a moderate amount of flexibility. This is something that I have argued in India, where the labor laws give very little flexibility, and I would argue the same. You need a social welfare mechanism whereby the people, when they are in and out of the labor market, they are being protected. But that should be a universal coverage without that much tying up with the particular job in which you are, because that will give you flexibility to move from one job to another. That is not easy. That does need changes, but I feel the entire Eurozone and maybe EU needs to come together, get a much more coherent labor market policy. The sort of thinking which is today beginning to go into the banking policy ought to go into labor market policy, and some of these tensions would go away if we can attend to that.
Dunque, la mia domanda riguarda un'eventuale guerra delle valute.
What about a potential currency war? You said that the best way to counter that, to avoid that, is to have one central institution pulling together many countries, not all of them, maybe 20 out of 30. But don't you think that we're going to have a raw material war? Because certainly there's going to be a mass of people in these 20 countries, which is going to be similar to the mass of country elsewhere. So the war of currency certainly could change with a new currency. But then the only thing which is going to be valuable maybe could be as it was in the 17 countries, even to have a guarantee as they have in the US that they can mint as much money as they want, or the ownership of raw material? Don't you think that the possession of raw material could give back new value to the currency? Don't we think that we're going to go back to a situation where we have currency that has a value against gold, so with raw materials being the gold, the new gold?
Let me take this. I have to say, the gold connection I did not follow fully, but the country grouping, what I'm suggesting is something like 20-25 of the most major economies. There will be one kind of war, of course, even with this, which will be a war inside the room when all 20 of them are having a discussion. But it's better to have it there than that to spill out. It's a bit like, you know, in 2008 when the G20 countries were talking about fiscal policy. There would be a lot of very heated debate inside the room. But for the first time, there was some coordination on that policy, and the crisis, they did battle. The other risk that you are talking about, that there can be other groups of central banks that will battle this, I don't think there is that risk if you take the world's 20-25 most major central banks together. The risk over there is a little bit of a risk, that they will turn aggressively on the other countries that remain out. And certainly that would be a dreadful thing to happen. I frankly don't have an easy answer. I just like to believe that human beings, when they attend to their own interest, they also realize that there is something beyond the self-interest of the group. You have a collective interest of the world. I know the world does not always work out that way. People, when they get together, they tend to be collusive, but what else do you do? We are not yet in a position to bring 200 central banks together into a room for one common policy. But at least if the major ones do that, and do that with a bit of a changed view. You know, I want to also touch on one thing. Human altruism, I think economists have played a role in giving that too small a space. Altruism has a very important role in the functioning of our global economy. We need to drum that in so that something which is natural in us does not die down and goes into even the boardrooms of that.
Allora, la signora bionda, la ragazza bionda e poi lei.
Two more requests for the floor. Thank you. I'm going to voice my question in English.
My question to you was, you talk about the need to challenge and question and rethink a bit about the discipline of economics. What is your thoughts on the idea of moving away from kind of the need or the obsession of growth in the more developed economies, especially given the lack of correlation past a certain point between GDP and well-being and happiness?
Let me take one more.
Yes, please. Un'altra domanda, la rispondiamo insieme.
Grazie. La mia domanda si ricollega in parte.
Thank you. I'd like to go back to what was just said. What is the final achievement for economics? What is the final objective?
Okay, shall we take one more? Let's take.
Thank you, Professor. Well, my question is about, you mentioned the need of collective global rules before. And my question is, you mentioned that we need global monetary policy in some sense for the world. And you also mentioned that we need in Europe fiscal policy beyond the common monetary policy. My question is, should we need in the future also a global fiscal policy? Thanks.
Yeah, shall we take? Okay, let me take these three questions. The first two are connected, so let me take them together. The rethinking, the GDP and happiness, I'm coming to that in a moment. The main rethinking that we need to do is to situate economics within the larger social disciplines. This is something which has had early literature. You know, Karl Polanyi wrote about the importance of embedding economics in the other social and political disciplines. So that's what I was primarily talking about. But when you mention targets like GDP and what should we do, happiness is important. You want to track happiness, but I have to say, I remain a bit skeptical about these happiness studies, because when you ask a person, are you happy or how happy you are, the answer that you give is more culturally dependent than an actual reflection of your happiness. So I might say, oh, I'm very happy, and that this could be that the Indian culture says that you're supposed to say you're happy when you're asked that question, or the other way around. You're supposed to say you're not happy. So I find these inter-country comparison of these happiness very difficult to interpret, so I would go for more traditional measures. Measures, there are galore, and we are looking at a whole lot. Very important work by Stiglitz and Amartya Sen on how do you measure development. We at the World Bank have now come out with an important new measure of a country's performance, which is actually to me very important, which is learning to evaluate a country by focusing on the bottom 40% of the population. So if that segment does well, that country gets a greater tribute. So focus on the bottom end of the population, which means, of course, you can't ignore the people above that, because if you ignore people above the bottom 40%, they will fall into your bottom 40%. But the focus is at the bottom 40%. This is the notion of shared prosperity that the World Bank has officially declared as one of its two major targets, and I think it is a good one. What is the final objective of economics? The final objective is a better world. A better world is a loosely defined term, but that is what you're after. You want to create a more harmonious world, a happier world. And I feel a better world has to be defined in a way where when we are thinking of a better world, we don't think of our individual identity, of my nation, my race, my religion. We must not think along those lines. We have to think collectively, our common world. This is very close to my heart, that the world is too small today to think of different identities, and our roots are all common. We come from the same genetic pool. We have to think of a better world. But I also have to put in a scientist's word. A lot of scientific analysis takes place without really thinking of the larger objectives. And that's the way it has to be. When an economist is trying to understand the link between monetary policy and inflation, usually that person is obsessed with the science of it. What does the central bank do? What happens to prices is a deep scientific question. It's like Pythagoras looking at right-angled triangles and thinking, what is the relationship between the squares on the sides? And that's the way science progresses. So individual researchers will, of course, be focused on, like a scientist, on their little problems, but together you're trying to create a better world. And finally, since I know the name, Karima asked the question on monetary policy coordination and fiscal policy coordination. I think the urgent need right now is monetary policy around the world, but the fiscal one is also extremely important. And let me, since you ask, let me elaborate for two reasons. One is, as the Eurozone crisis is seeing, that getting a group of countries together under a monetary union without sufficient attention being paid about fiscal coordination can lead to trouble. Europe is acting on that. But there is a larger global question, something that everybody is beginning to write and worry about today, is with so many different fiscal codes around the world, taxation policy is today in a mess. You produce in one country, open up a little shop in another country, show a lot of your profits in that country, and you avoid paying taxes. The Economist magazine had a cover story about big businesses that pay zero tax. I actually don't blame those businesses. If you have laws which allow you to take advantage, they will take advantage. The need is to have a common fiscal code of countries getting together from Italy through Germany, Switzerland, UK, India. Here I would try to bring the entire world together, have a common fiscal code, which is going to make it difficult for corporates to take advantage of the loophole. So yes, there is a very, very big need for fiscal policy coordination as well.
Volevo porre.
My question is as follows. You showed a number of charts, and we know that analysis is carried out by experts. And what I want to know is the movement of capitals by means of corruption and drug traffic. Is that ever included? Is that ever heeded? Time is nearly up. We have to follow the strict rules of the Trento Festival, so I was wondering whether there's one final question before we answer to the previous one.
Question concerning the need for global democratic norms. That was a very interesting point of your discussion. Are you, if I interpret correctly, saying that we need to devise methods so that everybody who is affected by a decision, by a policy, have a right to say? Is this something related to discussion on global deliberation? Thank you.
Yeah. The first one on drug capital and corrupt capital, the figures on which these calculations are based, unfortunately, don't take into account those capital, not because we don't want to, but because by their very nature, you don't get data on that. So drug capital, corrupt capital ought to be measured. And there is a lot of effort from indirect sources to get those numbers. But by their very nature, they are very difficult to get a sense of, are we doing that right or not? So that's where we are. And you know, when I was doing my previous job in India, that was also extremely important because there's a lot of illegal movement of capital in and out of countries. And we had commissions and groups trying to track this, but very difficult. That's all I will say that we are trying to do better. Global democracy is exactly that problem. You know, what is democracy? If you think of, there are many requirements, but the most important requirement is that you get to exercise a vote when a leader is being chosen. If that leader's actions are going to influence your welfare, you get to vote on that. Strictly, if you have United States is such a powerful country that who becomes president of United States has an impact on the well-being of people around the world. So if you had a truly democratic system in the world, the whole world would be voting for the American presidential election. But you know, you're not going to get to that. You are going to have votes taking place within each countries. So how do you do it? You have to have more fora, different settings, and actually World Bank is one such setting of multilateral organizations where you give a much greater voice to the small entities in sub-Saharan Africa who have no voice. You want World Trade Organizations, World Labor Organizations, where you begin to give them voice of a kind that they do not have. And I feel that is the direction in which we need to move. And just like we know that the first constructions of democracy were extremely hard, and the early constructions of democracy, you left out people that you were not even aware of. Go back to Greece, 300 BC. Democracy within the city-state was supposed to be fully democratic, but when you look back, you realize that there were two categories of people they were leaving out. But those two categories were so outside their consciousness that they didn't even realize. Women were never allowed to vote. Slaves were never allowed to vote. So when you're celebrating democracy, you're still leaving out groups. We have to battle that. It'll be a slow, long-drawn battle to get them all included.
Bene, il nostro incontro è finito, ringraziamo.
Our time is up. We'd like to thank Professor BASU and We hope to see him again in 20.